April 7th, 1945. The war in Europe was in its last preted violent weeks. The Eastern Front groaned under the weight of the Soviet advance. Berlin's outer defenses were collapsing, and the Reich that once promised 1,000 years of dominance had only days left to live. In the small German town of Alengrabo, 70 kilometers west of the capital, a young woman named Hedwig Müller stood at the cracked window of a derelict schoolhouse, her breath fogging against the cold glass. She was only 23, yet her face carried the fatigue of 3 lifetimes. 3 years of service as a Helferin, one of the thousands of young women conscripted into the Wehrmacht's auxiliary forces, had ground her down into something brittle. Exhausted and numb, she expected horror. Every speech she had heard from party officials, every pamphlet shoved into her hands, every rumor whispered in the corridors of her barracks, had prepared her for the arrival of the Americans as a nightmare. These soldiers were supposed to be barbarians, mongrel hordes who would pillage, rape, and burn. She braced herself for the chaos of drunken gangsters in uniform, for the wild cruelty of men raised without discipline, for the retribution promised by Joseph Goebbels' relentless propaganda machine. But when the fog lifted that morning, what she saw tore a hole straight through years of indoctrination. Down the main street of the battered town, columns of American soldiers moved with an orderliness that startled her. Their uniforms were intact, their boots clean, their equipment gleaming under a pale sun. Trucks rumbled past in numbers. She could hardly fathom so many trucks that the ground seemed to tremble endlessly beneath their weight. She realized, in a sickening rush, that she had never seen so many functioning vehicles in all her years of war. Germany, by then, ran on scraps, patched uniforms, broken down carts, soldiers scavenging fuel. Yet these men seemed to exist in a different world entirely, one of abundance and confidence. Then came the moment that seared itself into Hedwig's memory. She watched as a dark-skinned American soldier, an African American, whose very existence had been framed to her as proof of Allied degeneracy, bent down and handed a bar of chocolate to a cluster of thin, wary German children. Their faces lit up in disbelief. Hedwig felt her chest tighten. In her diary, she would later write, they looked like giants, not only in height, but in the way they carried themselves. Men who had never known true hunger. Men who could afford to give away what we could no longer dream of. This was not the nightmare she had been promised. It was something worse. The undeniable evidence that everything she had believed about her nation's superiority was a lie. For months, Nazi propaganda had insisted that the Allies were collapsing under their own weakness, that America in particular was decadent, morally corrupt, incapable of sustaining a war of this scale. Yet here, at the very moment when Germany itself was unraveling, stood proof of the opposite. The Americans were not collapsing. They were overflowing with trucks, with fuel, with cigarettes and soap, with bread so white it seemed like a dream, overflowing with strength, discipline, and most disorienting of all, generosity. And as American military police established a protective perimeter around Hedwig's quarters, not to harm her or her fellow auxiliaries, but to shield them from angry civilians seeking revenge, her world cracked open. The Reich that had sworn to bring glory and destiny had left her without food, without safety, without even soap to wash her hands. Yet the inferiors she had been told to despise were handing out medicine, blankets, and smiles with all their teeth intact. This was the beginning of a psychological collapse that thousands of German women would share in those final weeks of war. Mal soldier, when captured, experienced defeat in the chaos of battlefields and prison marches. But the Helferinnen, confined in schoolhouses, bunkers, and camps, confronted defeat more slowly, more intimately. They had time to watch, to compare, to think, day after day. They saw with their own eyes the gulf between propaganda and reality widen until the entire edifice crumbled. Hedwig's astonishment was not unique. From the Rhine to Thuringia, from makeshift bunkers to commandeered hotels, auxiliaries like her found themselves staring into the faces of their supposed enemies and seeing not monsters, but well-fed men with enough abundance to share. For women who had been told since childhood that scarcity was noble and sacrifice divine, the shock was profound. And yet, Hedwig's story was more than just a personal revelation. It was a microcosm of the collapse of Nazi ideology itself. In that single morning of April 1945, one young woman witnessed not just the end of a war, but the implosion of an entire belief system. What followed in the weeks and months ahead, internment, re-education, reintegration, would expose these women to realities that no speech, no propaganda real, and no party slogan could withstand. This is the story of the Helferinnen at the end of the Second World War. Women indoctrinated to believe in German superiority, brought face to face with the overwhelming evidence of American abundance. Their journey from fear to shock, from disbelief to transformation, tells us not only about the end of the Third Reich, but about the ways human beings, when confronted with undeniable reality, must choose between clinging to illusion or building a new understanding of the world. And it begins with a simple, unforgettable moment, the taste of chocolate in a child's hands, offered by the enemy who wasn't an enemy at all. To understand the depth of Hedwig Müller's shock on that April morning, we must look backward into the carefully constructed illusions that shaped her world. She was not born into a neutral landscape of ideas. From the time she first entered school in the 1932nd, every poster on the walls, every film projected onto a classroom screen, every radio broadcast playing in her village had been steeped in a single purpose: to define enemies and heroes as the Nazi regime wanted them to be seen. The architect of this manufactured reality was Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda. His ministry churned out an astonishing volume of material, over 1,000 films, countless newsreels, pamphlets, children's books, and radio speeches. The message was relentless. Germany stood at the apex of civilization, while its enemies, particularly America, were portrayed as degenerate, corrupt, and racially inferior. In Nazi propaganda, the United States was often shown not as a formidable industrial powerhouse, but as a fractured society of gangsters and misfits. Posters depicted American soldiers as lazy cowboys and cigar-smoking mobsters. Films like Der Ewige Jude suggested that America was nothing more than a puppet of Jewish financiers. Magazines like Signal told German readers that the American military machine might be vast, but it was soft at its core, run by men too addicted to jazz, liqueur, and money to fight a disciplined war. For children like Hedwig, these messages weren't just background noise, they were the foundation of their worldview. She entered school just as Hitler consolidated power in 1933. Her adolescence unfolded during years when the Reich seemed unstoppable: the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, the annexation of Austria in 1938, the breathtaking collapse of France in 1940. To a teenage girl watching these triumphs, why wouldn't the Nazi worldview seem accurate? If Germany's predictions about victory kept coming true, then surely its claims about the weakness of its enemies must also be correct. But propaganda wasn't only about the enemies abroad, it was also about shaping the roles of Germans at home, especially women. By 1941, more than 100,000 young women had been recruited into military auxiliary service. They were trained not as combatants, but as the indispensable support network of the Wehrmacht: typists, radio operators, nurses, telephone clerks, translators. The training was brief, often just 4 weeks before they were dispatched to units across Europe. The contradictions of the Nazi regime were embedded even in the clothing they wore. Their uniforms, designed by Heinz Schultz-Nudam, a man who had once worked in fashion, struck a strange balance between practicality and appearance. They had to be efficient for long hours of communication work, yet they were tailored in ways that emphasized femininity. Women were expected to embody loyalty and discipline while remaining symbols of grace and German womanhood. It was as though the regime could not decide whether to see them as soldiers or as propaganda figures themselves. Here, comparisons with other nations are telling. In the Soviet Union, women fought on the front lines as snipers, machine gunners, even pilots of the famed Night Witches bombing squadrons. In Britain, women served in the Auxiliary Territorial Service, manned anti-aircraft guns, and worked in intelligence. America, too, had its Women's Army Corps and waves in the Navy. Only Nazi Germany held so firmly to gendered limits, confining its women to the shadow of its male soldiers while still demanding their full loyalty. The irony is stark. A regime that promised revolutionary change clung desperately to old hierarchies. As the war expanded, so too did the propaganda machines focus on America. When the United States entered the conflict in December 1941, the message hardened. Pamphlets circulated describing the U.S. Army as a chaotic force of mongrels, Italians, Irish, Jews, and African Americans united not by discipline but by greed. The Nazi newspaper Völkische Beobachter insisted American soldiers were cowboys and gangsters in uniform, unfit to stand against the elite German fighting man. Films like Ohm Kruger portrayed the British and Americans as ruthless colonizers, suggesting that Germany, if defeated, would suffer under the same kind of cruelty. By 1944 and early 1945, as the Reich situation grew desperate, this propaganda took on a darker, more fearful tone. Pamphlets warned civilians, especially women, that the Americans would unleash waves of rape, looting, and execution. Leaflets showed caricatures of African American soldiers as monstrous predators, designed to instill terror. Goebbels himself gave speeches declaring that Germany's women would suffer unimaginable horrors if the enemy reached their soil. For the Helferinnen, who often worked close to the front lines, these warnings were taken very seriously. It is important to note that this fear was not born entirely out of thin air. On the Eastern Front, German civilians and auxiliaries had already heard rumors, and in some cases seen firsthand, the brutality of the advancing Red Army mass rapes, killings, retribution for years of German atrocities. The Nazi state deliberately blurred the lines, suggesting that the Americans would be no different. For a young woman like Hedwig, the expectation of violence was absolute. And so, as dawn broke in April 1945, Hedwig's eyes were primed to see monsters. Instead, she saw the unthinkable. Order, discipline, abundance, even kindness. That moment only carried such power because of the years of carefully built illusions behind it. Her disbelief was not just about seeing chocolate handed to children. It was about realizing that her entire youth had been guided by a meticulously fabricated lie. This historical background matters because it explains why the encounters between German auxiliaries and American soldiers became such powerful psychological events. Propaganda had built up a wall of myths. Reality was about to smash through it. By the spring of 1945, Germany was collapsing in slow motion. Armies that once stormed across Europe were now reduced to scattered pockets of resistance, often abandoning positions before American or Soviet forces even arrived. For the Helferinnen, this collapse brought an unnerving mixture of uncertainty and fear. They were not soldiers in the strict sense, but they were in uniform, tied to the Wehrmacht, and subject to the same propaganda warnings that had painted their enemies as merciless invaders. Many of them genuinely believed their fate would be one of brutality, perhaps even death. The first encounters with American soldiers revealed a very different reality. Lieutenant Thomas Hargrove of the U.S. 89th Infantry Division recorded one such moment near Eisenach. He and his men found 30 German auxiliary women huddled inside a communications bunker. The women trembled as the soldiers approached. Their fear was so intense that several had packed small knives, prepared to resist what they assumed was inevitable assault. Instead, through an interpreter, Hardgrove explained that they would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. The relief was immediate. One woman began to sob when he handed her a U.S. Army field ration. Between tears, she repeated a single phrase, "Es ist zu viel," it's too much. And what moved her to tears was not cruelty, but the opposite, generosity in a form she had been told was impossible. American K-rations, even in their most basic form, were marvels of abundance to Germans accustomed to hunger. They contained canned meat, biscuits, coffee, Huger tablets, powdered lemonade, and, most astonishing of all, chocolate, to a woman whose daily meals had been reduced to watery soup and coarse bread. This box of food seemed extravagant beyond belief. The contrast went deeper than calories. In Germany, rations for civilians had dwindled to around 1.5 calories per day by 1944, and actual distributions often fell short of even that. Military personnel fared somewhat better, but by the final months of the war, shortages meant even soldiers were often malnourished. Black markets flourished, but only those with valuables or connections could find food. The Helferinnen, stuck in auxiliary service and without family wealth, lived in constant hunger. Now, suddenly, they were confronted with an army where the minimum daily intake for soldiers was 600 calories. Not only that, but these Americans treated food as if it were endless. Trucks rolled in with fresh deliveries every day. Soldiers casually tossed away half-finished rations. To women who had spent years licking their soup bowls clean, the waste was incomprehensible. Material abundance wasn't the only shock. For years, the German press had boasted of the Reich's industrial power, the supposed efficiency of its war machine. Yet to the auxiliaries, American logistics seemed like something from another world. Hubert, a communications clerk captured near Kassel, wrote in her diary that she had watched American supply officers discard 15 pairs of boots because of slight water damage. "Those boots," she noted, "would have supplied an entire platoon in our army. Men would have fought over them." To her, the sight was both enraging and awe-inspiring. How could a nation be so wealthy that even its waste was superior to Germany's best? This abundance extended into every corner of American life, as witnessed by the prisoners. Each soldier seemed to carry multiple sets of clothes, personal items like watches and cameras, and most astonishing, his own hygiene supplies, toothbrushes, razors, and bars of soap were so common that soldiers handed them out without ceremony. For the Helferinnen, who had long been deprived of even basic soap, this was as shocking as the chocolate. Erika Schmidt, a German auxiliary captured near Heidelberg, later remarked that she had been told Germans were conserving water because of Allied bombing. When she asked why Americans shaved daily with fresh water, an interpreter laughed and said, "In America, even poor people have running water." That simple statement struck her more deeply than any political lecture could. Perhaps the most profound challenge came from the presence of African American soldiers. Nazi propaganda had depicted them as dangerous, primitive, and violent. Yet in town after town, these women found African American troops acting with the same discipline and professionalism as their white counterparts. Helga Brandt, a medical auxiliary, admitted in her journal that she had been taught to believe black soldiers were barely above animals. Now she saw them handling vehicles, radios, and complex equipment with calm efficiency. "They speak better German than some of the Americans of German descent," she noted bitterly. This experience created deep cognitive dissonance. If everything she had been told about race was a lie, Then what else had been false? Here, the comparison with the Eastern Front is unavoidable. German auxiliaries knew what had happened when the Red Army advanced westward. Mass rapes, killings, acts of vengeance for years of German atrocities in Russia and Poland. These stories circulated widely, filling women with terror. By contrast, the Americans often did the opposite of what they feared. They protected auxiliaries from reprisals by civilians, offered medical care, and insisted on order. For many women, this difference between East and West became a defining memory of the war's end. The shock of defeat was not just military, it was existential. To stand face to face with soldiers who had been described as weak and degenerate, and to find instead strength, abundance, and courtesy, was to watch the very foundations of Nazi ideology crumble in real time. The trucks that kept rolling down German roads were not just carrying supplies. They were carrying undeniable evidence that Germany had fought an enemy it could never hope to match. For Hedwig Muller, and thousands like her, the first taste of American chocolate was not simply sweet, it was bitter. 2. It carried the flavor of a truth that could no longer be denied. They had been fighting ghosts of propaganda, while the real America had been preparing a war machine fueled by resources and confidence beyond imagination. The collapse of illusions had begun, and there was no turning back. By late April 1945, the Reich was in its death throes. Hitler still shouted fantasies about miracle weapons and last-minute salvation. But for the Helferinnen, the young women conscripted into the Wehrmacht's auxiliary services, there was no illusion left. Their everyday encounters with American soldiers, their exposure to material abundance, and their sudden safety under an occupying force they had been taught to fear, all converged into one overwhelming realization. Everything they had been told was collapsing. Not just Germany, not just the war, but the very worldview they had been raised to believe. The psychological break came slowly for some, instantly for others. For Hedwig Müller, it was the morning she first heard American music. A group of soldiers had set up a makeshift radio near the schoolhouse where she and other auxiliaries were being held. Out poured the warm, brassy tones of jazz. The music was unlike anything she had ever heard loose. Improvisational. Alive. Nazi authorities had condemned jazz as degenerate, the sound of a corrupt, mixed-race society. Yet here it was, played joyfully by men in spotless uniforms. Men who had brought order instead of chaos, bread instead of looting. Hedwig later wrote that she felt her chest tighten as she listened. If this is degeneration, then what is civilization? The collapse of ideology was not merely intellectual, it was emotional, physical, almost bodily. Years of hunger had carved these women into shadows of themselves. Now, with each cigarette, each bar of soap, each tin of canned meat casually offered by American soldiers, they felt a gnawing truth sink deeper. The nation that had promised them supremacy had left them starving. While the so-called inferiors had so much they could give it away, many auxiliaries recorded moments of rage directed not at the Americans, but at their own leaders. Ihr Schavuber, whose diary survives in fragments, wrote furiously after being given a wool blanket by an American officer. They said we were the chosen people, yet it is the enemy who keeps us warm. What then was our sacrifice for? A lie. Always a lie. Such testimonies reveal how the defeat was not only military, it was moral and spiritual. Perhaps the most shattering realization came through the racial question. For a decade, these women had been told that Aryan purity set them above all others. Yet the first American they saw handing chocolate to children might have been a black soldier. For some, the shock was unbearable. A former telephone operator in Leipzig recalled how one of her colleagues fainted upon being treated respectfully by an African-American GI. The fainting was not from fear, but from the intolerable weight of contradiction. If the hierarchy of race was false, then the entire Nazi cosmos, its laws, its slogans, its sacrifices collapsed into absurdity. The Americans, for their part, were aware of this power. They sometimes played with it deliberately, offering soap and cigarettes with a smile, or escorting auxiliaries through angry German crowds as a show of protection. Military police units were instructed to maintain strict discipline, precisely to contrast with the terror spread by Goebbels' propaganda. It was a kind of psychological warfare, though often carried out in small, everyday gestures. The collapse of illusions did not mean instant conversion. Many auxiliaries clung desperately to fragments of their old beliefs, if only to make sense of their suffering. Some tried to insist that America's abundance was merely temporary, a bubble that would burst after the war. Others muttered that the Americans were wasteful, spoiled, lacking the spiritual depth that Germany had cultivated in its hardship. But these explanations felt hollow, especially when spoken aloud, against the rumble of endless American convoys. Such excuses dissolved like mist. Internment camps soon became laboratories of disillusionment. Thousands of auxiliaries were gathered in makeshift barracks, watched over by young GIs, fed with American rations, sometimes questioned by interpreters. Life was monotonous, but it carried with it daily reminders of defeat. The women saw American trucks arriving with mail and packages from home, fresh fruit, newspapers, even baseball gloves. They watched soldiers throw away cigarette butts, still half-smoked. They heard rumors that in America, every family owned a car, every child drank milk, every house had electricity. To women who had lived through bombings and cold, who had shared beds in unheated barracks, such stories seemed like fairy tales. The collapse of ideology was complete when many auxiliaries began to turn their resentment not against the enemy, but against the Reich itself. They had been used, deceived, and abandoned. Their leaders had promised them superiority and delivered only rubble and hodas. By the end of May 1945, the diaries of several Helferinnen contain the same bitter refrain: "We were lied to." The climax of this collapse was not a single battle or surrender document. It was 1,000 small moments: the first bite of white bread, the first hot shower in months, the sight of an African-American soldier smiling politely, the bewildering sound of jazz echoing in a ruined German town. Each moment struck like a hammer against the fragile edifice of Nazi ideology, and each moment pushed the auxiliaries further into a new and terrifying truth. The world was not as they had been taught. It had never been. By June, Germany lay prostrate under Allied occupation. The Reich was gone. But for the Helferinnen, the real story was what had collapsed inside them. The collapse of illusions, the death of a worldview, the recognition that the very foundation of their lives, belief in German greatness, trust in their leaders, the certainty of racial superiority had been nothing more than smoke. In that rubble of ideology, one question lingered like ash. If everything they had believed was false, what could possibly take its place? When the shooting stopped and the Reich lay in ruins, the Helferinnen, the young women who had served in Germany's auxiliary services, were left with a burden that could not be discharged by surrender alone. They had not fought with rifles or commanded divisions, but their war was no less real. It had been a war of ideas, waged inside their minds. A war between the illusions they had been fed and the truths they had been forced to witness. The immediate aftermath of the war thrust them into an uneasy limbo. Many were interned in makeshift camps, where they lived under American guard but in conditions far better than they had expected. They were fed, clothed, and often employed in clerical work for their captors. Yet each day of safety only deepened their awareness of betrayal. The Reich had demanded their loyalty to the end, filling their ears with promises of glory and warnings of terror. And when defeat came, it was the barbarians who treated them with humanity, while their own leaders vanished into bunkers or fled like cowards. For some, this contradiction was unbearable. Diaries from the months after surrender show women grappling with shame, guilt, and disorientation. Hedwig Müller, whose story opened this account, filled her notebook with reflections on the simplest details: the taste of white bread, the smell of soap, the sound of jazz on the radio. These everyday encounters with American abundance haunted her more deeply than any battlefield. She confessed that she felt as if a curtain has been torn away. And I see that the play was false from the beginning. Others responded differently. Some auxiliaries clung to bitterness, refusing to admit their illusions had collapsed. They told themselves that American power was temporary, that material abundance did not equal cultural superiority, that Germany would one day rise again. These attempts at self-consolation often appeared in conversations within internment camps, but they grew weaker with time. Reality had a way of pressing itself upon the senses. The endless convoys, the food that never ran out, the discipline of soldiers who had been painted as savages. In the long term, the memory of these encounters became part of Germany's larger struggle with its past, what would later be called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or coming to terms with the past. For men, this often meant confronting their role in combat or atrocities. For the Helferinnen, it meant confronting their complicity in a system that had lied to them, and reckoning with the humiliation of discovering that their worldview had been not only wrong but absurd. The legacy of this collapse of illusions lingered for decades. Many auxiliaries returned to civilian life carrying quiet scars, rarely speaking of their service. When they did, it was often in the language of disillusionment. They spoke not of triumphs or duties fulfilled, but of the moment they realized they had been deceived. The chocolate bar given to a child, the soap pressed into their hands, the African-American soldier who offered them protection instead of violence. These small, ordinary gestures became symbols of an extraordinary psychological shift. What can we learn from their story? At its core, the experience of the Helferinnen at the end of World War II reveals the devastating power of propaganda and the equally devastating power of reality to undo it. For years, they had been told that Germany was strong and the world outside weak. In the spring of 1945, reality arrived in the form of convoys, rations, music, and discipline. The illusions shattered, not in fiery battles, but in quiet, human encounters that stripped ideology bare. This collapse of illusions also reminds us of the fragility of belief itself. Human beings can be persuaded to believe almost anything if it is repeated loudly enough, early enough, and with enough apparent confirmation. But when confronted with undeniable evidence, when the taste of chocolate defies the story of barbarism, when the sight of abundance defies the myth of superiority, belief can collapse in an instant. For Hedwig Müller and countless others, that collapse was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it revealed that their sacrifices, their hunger, their loyalty had been for nothing but lies. Liberating because it opened the possibility of a new life built on truth rather than illusion. In the end, the story of the Helferinnen is not just about the defeat of Nazi Germany. It is about the defeat of delusion by reality, of myth by experience. It is a reminder that ideologies, no matter how powerful, cannot forever withstand the simple, stubborn evidence of the real world. And perhaps that is why the image that endures from those last days of April 1945 is not one of flags or speeches, but of something smaller and more human. A child holding an American chocolate bar, a young woman watching in disbelief, and a world of lies crumbling silently around them.